everyone's having a good day. It's been a crazy wild one for me. And so I'm thrilled to be able to share with you what I have to talk about this subject as of a couple hours ago, because as we all know, things are changing and changing rapidly in this space. What I wanted to really talk about today is a little bit about the election calendar, kind of where we are, where things stand, talk about voter registration, in-person voting, give a vote by mail update. As John mentioned, I just did a whole hour-long session on vote by mail, but I think there are some things we want to revisit that have changed just in the last couple of weeks. And then a little bit about messaging to voters and some of the resources that are out there to help improve your reporting and give you some quick access to some of the answers that you're looking for. I'm going to kind of sprinkle that throughout the entire presentation. So we really don't have much time until the election begins. Ballots will mail out in every state of the country on September 19th to military and overseas voters. In some cases, they'll mail out earlier for absentee or vote by mail ballot voters, but every state in the country will have ballots mailing out on September 19th. So when I often hear people talking about the election being months away, it's weeks away. We also know that there are different calendars that are going to inform this election, and one of them happened to be the legislative calendars. So I wanted to share this with you because it's something to keep an eye on, particularly in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and North Carolina, in New York, to look and see, and also in Michigan, to see if they bring them back in for a special session, to see if in fact there is legislation that's moving that will be impactful for this particular election coming up. The Wall Street Journal had a really interesting graphic that came out that I think is really indicative of where we're at right now as it relates to mail-in balloting rules. And so when you look at this, and this came out literally like maybe a week ago, but there have been changes since then. So in this graphic, it shows us that New York is requiring a justification for mail-in voting, and as though COVID is not a reason, but in fact, you can use COVID as your reason to vote absentee in New York City. You can also use it in Mississippi now. They're clarifying that you just need to select 5A or 5B on the application form. And even in places like Texas, we have the Harris County Clerk, which is the largest county in Texas, one of the largest counties in the country, mailing out applications to all of their registered voters and making sure voters understand these are the requirements if you want to vote by mail. So this is really changing quickly. And not only do we have legislative changes, but litigation. So Justin Levitt is a law professor and attorney, and he just tweeted this out a couple days ago on the 23rd, that we were up to 215 COVID-related election cases in 43 of the states, including in DC and now Puerto Rico. And then just a couple of hours later, an update of, wait a minute, here's another one, 216. So this can change some of the rules and information and ways in which our voters are going to participate. We also want to keep an eye on the security stories of what's happening out in the ether, right? Up until the pandemic, cybersecurity was really pretty much all election officials were being talked to about and talking about. And just because we are now dealing with a global pandemic does not mean that those foreign actors have given us a pass on what's going to happen in just a few short weeks. So it's important to keep an eye on that front as well. We do know there's just some late breaking news that didn't make it into the slide presentation about some mis and disinformation that's circulating in Michigan. And so we want to make sure that the accessibility for voters to use different channels of voting, that when wrong information is being shared, that we get in front of it. And I often say we kind of need to peel back some of the layers of the onion of the story before we know exactly the heart of the matter and where things are coming from and what the potential impact could be. And these are a couple of examples from the primary, right? So, and both of these were pulled down off of the social media platforms that they were on. And they had to do with spreading information around voting by mail or being a postal employee that's ripping up certain kinds of absentee ballots and what have you. And that's where it's important that voters understand what the rules and regulations are. And as reporters, I often say you need to know what's right in order to identify what's wrong. And so if you are a national reporter, you have a really difficult job in that you need to kind of have an idea of what's happening all over the country. When if you're in a local newsroom or a newsroom that only has maybe 1 or 2 markets in 1 or 2 states, you have a little bit more leeway and can really dive deep and understand the complexities of just your localized environment. We also know that the social media platforms are responding to mis and disinformation in a new way this election cycle, and that in and of itself can be a story about what is getting pulled down, when it's getting pulled down, and oftentimes how long it takes before the information is removed. One thing that I wanted to highlight today is a more recent study, and this was done by the Voter Study Group at Democracy Fund, which is where I work. I'm a senior advisor to the elections program. And we have a division called the Voter Study Group, and I'm going to share some of their other resources later on. But this is a survey that came out, and they basically asked voters, if you voted in person in 2016, how are you going to vote in 2020? And for each type of voting. And I highlighted in green the voters who said they were going to vote in the same way. So we have, 60% of them, almost 59% said they're going to vote on election day, 66 said they're going to or vote early in person before election day, 66% on election day, and what have you. But what we're seeing is some pretty dramatic shifts of 18 to 20% of our voters are going to vote in a different way this election. And that'll be important they understand what those options are when they decide to go and vote. So I thought we'd start off with revisiting kind of the basic tranches of election administration and the stories that might be out there, particularly surrounding voter registration, because it all starts with the voter rolls. And this year, we're not going to see the same kind of voter registration efforts that normally occur in a presidential year. Normally, we have, this is the Bernalillo County Clerk in New Mexico, and here she's out, at a festival registering voters. We aren't going to see the third-party groups and election officials and candidates and campaigns, pressing the palms in the flesh, getting information out to voters. And that's where they're going to start relying more heavily on the news that you're reporting, as well as the social media platforms, really trying to reach out and meet voters where they are. So we'll see a more concerted effort with some of the platforms coordinating with one another. This was a Facebook and an Instagram coordination around voter registration. We know that because unfortunately so many of our fellow citizens are hospitalized and or are receiving health care at this moment, that hospitals have gotten together with and formed this effort called Vote ER, and allowing their doctors and nurses to aid their patients in registering to vote, which is, a very interesting story when you think about how in this moment are we having people be impacted. We also know that National Voter Registration Day is coming up in September, and that has become a national holiday in many places. And that's a way of just reminding individuals that it is, in fact, the first step in voting in many places. But we know that in this moment, registration will affect different people in a variety of ways. And also in this moment, there are going to be other factors that'll inform whether or not they get registered and can participate. So stories like this where we think about, wait a minute, we've got a lot of people in nursing homes that are even more isolated and quarantined than in the past. Many of those places used to be polling places, and they won't be in this moment. So how will those individuals get registered? How will they, in fact, be able to participate? As well as all of the critical environmental factors that we're looking at. So we have the massive wildfires, the multiple hurricanes hitting the Gulf Coast, as well as tornadoes, windstorms. All of these things can affect and displace people and affect the way in which they're registered and where they're registered and when and how they vote. Whoops, sorry, it went one too fast. Also in this moment, we have evictions that are skyrocketing, and we have the very interesting story, I thought, from the Tampa Bay Times around the impact of the coronavirus and citizenship. So naturalization ceremonies usually occur all throughout the country, all throughout the calendar. I know when I was an election official in Arizona, we had a naturalization ceremony at the Sandra Day O'Connor federal courthouse twice a day on Fridays, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And each session there'd be anywhere from 100 to maybe 200 or 300 people would become citizens. In this moment, those types of citizen naturalization ceremonies are not happening, and it's delaying some people from being able to not only gain their citizenship, but to be able to participate in this election. So policies across the country, really vary. This is one that is one of my favorites, and it allows young people to pre-register. So when they go to get their driver's license when they're 16 or 17, they can also say they want to register to vote in much the same way that you would do selective service. And then when they turn 18 years old in Florida, they're automatically registered. Those kind of practices and policies really help in this moment because we aren't requiring that individual to interact with someone in order to get registered. Circle, which is at Tufts University, has a lot of information, data and studies on youth registration, young voting, and also in this moment we'll have a lot of first-time voters. And so that is another resource that you might want to check out. There are 3 other policies around voter registration that in this moment, the states that have adopted them are better positioned than those that have not, and that's automatic voter registration, online voter registration, and then also being a member of the Electronic Registration Information Center, commonly referred to as ERIC, because that allows for the states to share information with one another and identify voters who are not registered and reach out to them in order to get them registered. So traditionally, these 3 policy decisions have really helped voter rolls become cleaner, more accurate. But in this moment again, here we are where the Department of Motor Vehicles and the registrations under motor voter have fallen off so dramatically, and that impacts that automatic or automated voter registration. So even though states have done some of these policies, they're still being impacted in this moment. And we know that 40% of Americans don't necessarily know that they're supposed to update their registration when they move. And that can be a real challenge because if you're in a state like California or Nevada or New Jersey, where they'll now be mailing out ballots to any registered voter, if that address isn't updated, the ballot's going to come back to the elections office as undeliverable, and that voter would need to go and vote in person. We also know that even when these policies take place, voters don't necessarily always know that they're available to them. So 1 in 4 voters, and this is from the CCES, from 2018, I believe, or 19. 1 in 4 voters said they didn't have online voter registration in their state, but they did have it available to them. And then half of the voters that said they didn't know if it was available actually had online voter registration available. So in your reporting, it might come across as maybe an offhand comment, but even just to remind voters of the services that they can receive online, particularly in this COVID moment, is really important. Because far too often, people don't understand voter registration and the distinction between active voters and inactive voters, and there are a lot of lawsuits and challenges around people saying that there are more registered voters than there are citizens in a state. Well, the distinction here is that under the Motor Voter Act, or the NVRA, if a piece of mail comes back saying that a voter has moved, the election official has to send them a confirming notice to say, the Postal Service is saying you've moved, is this true or not? If the voter doesn't contact the elections office, they're moved to inactive status. If they appear to vote, they would be allowed to vote and everything would just be updated. But it is not the case that the sometimes, hundreds or thousands of people on an inactive voting list, they do not get mailed a ballot. They are not included in the active information going out to individuals. And so it's really important that we hear about these stories, that we understand the distinction between active voters and inactive voters, or voters who have moved but haven't received final notification from the voter that they can, in fact, come off the voter rolls. Another interesting project that you might want to dig into a little bit if you're looking for another angle on how to cover elections is NISJIC, which is just a fun acronym to say, has an effort called the Geoenabled Elections. And Geoenabled Elections is really looking at how can we expand the use of GIS in elections, because even though GIS services have been around for decades now, it's not as widely used in elections and state and local election officials' offices as you would think. The legislatures use them and use it in redistricting, but when it comes to putting a voter in a voting precinct, oftentimes that's being done manually and not leveraging the technology of GIS. So there are pilot projects going all across the country. And why this is so critical is that it makes sure that voters are actually in the right district in the system for the ballot that they're going to receive. So the basic eligibility foundation is part of what district or what precinct you get put in. And this is a really interesting program that was started about 2 years ago now and is expanding into other states. So let's talk a little bit about in-person voting. You know, some of the stories I think to watch are some of the declarations around will masks be necessary or not necessary? What kind of social distancing protocols are being enforced or not enforced at a state level or at a local level? Not only does this inform and help a voter decide, you know, maybe I'm immunocompromised and I'm trying to decide if in fact I should go vote in person or if I should vote by mail. This is a sort of information that will help voters make informed choices. We also know that some of those decisions are influencing whether or not individuals want to work as a poll worker. And even in this case, these 3 election officials in Cass County resigned because they didn't feel that their county was providing them with enough support in order to maintain the health and safety of themselves and their families. And so they quit. These were permanent election officials in Cass County. We know that in this moment, we also have trying to have a unifying message. So we have National Voter Registration Day that's now been around for about a decade. And in this moment, we're trying to coalesce around voting early. And whether that means mailing back your vote by mail ballot or going early in person, shifting some of that volume away from Tuesday's election or away from the final days of early voting to some of the earlier days where you won't find a line. Sometimes you won't even see another voter if you shift that voting behavior. So there's something like Vote Early Day is a relatively new phenomenon this year. It'll be October 24th. And that's something to kind of champion and identify what's happening in your local area around that. Now, many of you are going to have some questions around the protocols, the laws that are, you know, what's happening in your state or across the board, or maybe you're covering a new state that you haven't, you know, covered in the past and you're unfamiliar with it. So the National Conference of State Legislators, or NCSL, has some really fabulous tables around some of these policy decisions. And I'm going to share a few of them as we go through. Here's one on poll workers, and it explains, you know, can you have youth poll workers? What are poll workers, you know, working the whole day? Are there shifts? Are they allowed to serve as unpaid volunteers? Do they have to live in the same precinct where they're you know, working? What are some of the requirements? And that's where you can also get some interesting and rich stories around the types of poll workers that are being looked for. So poll worker shortages are always an issue, and more so now even than ever before, given that so many of our poll workers are tend to be retirees and older individuals, but also finding poll workers that can provide assistance to voters as necessary. So voters that have language skills or have additional skill sets that are helpful in making sure voters have a good voting experience can be some really interesting stories. Oops, I went back instead of forward. Sorry about that. There, we did it again. In addition to the impact on poll workers, we have the impact on polling locations. On the right-hand side here, this is from Jamie Hsu, who's an election official in Kansas. And he was lamenting the fact that he was having polling facilities say that they couldn't use them as a polling location a little more than a month and a half before the election. We know that there's all sorts of concern around the cleansing protocols, following CDC requirements, and it's really going to be an interesting way to see what do polling locations look like. We saw a little bit of this in the primary. So the drive-through locations that we saw in Wisconsin, a lot of curbside voting are some of the solutions that people are talking about. And many of these kinds of decisions are actually rooted in state law. So in some places, it can only be a government building. Other places it can be a private location, but you can't have to pay for it. You don't have to pay rent or anything like that. Other places it's kind of open and available. So that's where you see things like, and this in of itself is an interesting story, I think. You see polling locations at the bottom of the Grand Canyon for the Havasupai tribe. You see polling locations in casinos in Clark County, Nevada, or in laundromats in Cook County in Illinois, or there's a wide variety of where facilities can be. My favorite one when I was an election official in Arizona, it was somewhat questionable perhaps, but we had no other recourse. It was in a mortuary, in a mortuary. And the funny story there was that we got a call from the mortuary. It was a lovely, lovely location, beautiful building, but our poll workers borrowed a table to use for their potluck, because it's always about the potluck. And unfortunately, it wasn't a table that anyone should have been putting anything onto. I'll just leave it at that. We also know that many jurisdictions are still looking for facilities right now. And that's where there's kind of been a plea going out to commerce, to business and corporations to say, if you have not only the ability to encourage workers, employees to work as poll workers, but if you have facilities that can be used as a polling location, we'd love to talk to you. And therein lies where we have seen this new shift to more expansive and emergency powers being allowed to invoke more options in some states, saying, in this moment, we're going to allow for a centralized polling location to service the whole community, and we're going to use, these coliseums and arenas. Or in some cases, just having the gymnasium in all of a school district, like this one in Johnson County, Kansas, was really, really helpful. And so it's important that in this moment we realize polling locations are going to be, we need bigger locations to allow for social distancing. And in reality, we're going to need more of them. But let's talk a little bit about lines. I served on President Obama's Commission on Election Administration, and the ability to identify where the lines were happening, how to estimate when the lines were going to form was really critical. And we heard from Charles Stewart at MIT, and this Caltech MIT program had put out 3 different calculators. And I want to show you the pink one, which is called the Line Optimization by Mark Pelzarski. And what we're looking at here is election officials or reporters can go into this online tool, and you can put in, how many estimated voters you think they're going to get at a polling location. If you know how many check-in locations they're going to have, you can put those in. If you know how many voting stations they're going to have, you can put in that information. And this will give you a line estimator for the course of the election day. So in this instance here, we're looking at check-ins, which is the yellow. And if we know that it's about a minute and a half to check in, and there's 2 check-in stations, it's about 7 minutes. But if something happens, whether it's a new voter ID law or somebody has additional questions, and there's 30 seconds more added to that interaction, we now have an hour-long wait. But if we add 1 additional station, it brings that wait time down. So this tool is something that you can use if there are areas in the urban centers or the rural centers that you cover, and you're concerned about whether or not there'll be long lines there because maybe there were long lines there before. It's an interesting way to be able to identify where those things may be. Now, MIT also just put out this new kind of reworking or expanded version of what was on the previous screen on the Graves tool. And this takes into account CDC recommendations for social distancing. So you can actually see how, by using social distancing, will this facility be sufficient anymore? And this is all available to anyone to use, but you do need to have a little bit of the background on what the election officials are using in that area. I also like to talk about what exactly do we mean when we talk about voting equipment, and what is voting equipment to you? Because when we cover stories about voting equipment, voters have a very distinct impression of what that means. And is it the electronic poll book? Is it in fact the ballot on demand printer that's used in many jurisdictions? Is it the ballot marking device, or is it the machine that counts the ballots, the tabulator? So it's important that we hone in on the exact types of language that we're using when we cover all of these things. Another complicating factor in the coronavirus, as we plan and think about how we prepare for the election period, is monitoring on election day. And in many cases, there are very set ways in which someone can be and serve as a monitor or an observer in the polling place. So NCSL has this great map you can go in, and by hovering over a state, it pulls up whether or not there are policies that allow for observation and who is allowed under their laws. One of the challenges here is that with the CDC guidelines, we have set numbers of people who can be in a room at any given time. If we have more observers or challengers, each one of those positions could be negating a voter that could be in the room in the act of voting. And so we want to keep an eye on the calls for observation, the calls for challengers, and I will tell you they happen every federal election. And I've been doing this since 2004. Every federal election, they say there's going to be lots of observers out there to make sure that there isn't any fraud and impersonation of voters and all these other things. And I've yet to see where there have been very many people show up, which is not to say this isn't the year it's going to happen. It's also critical to contemplate, if you're looking to get footage or B-roll in the polls, to know which states allow for that and which ones do not. So some states don't allow any sort of filming while voters are present, but they might allow you in to catch images of the poll workers setting up, and then at the end of the day as well. The requirements, of course, are always things we need to cover, whether it's the number of hours for voting, the sites and the locations, whether an ID is required, ballot drop-off options. All of these things are up in the air right now in some states. And so knowing the extended hours that might occur or not is going to be really an important factor. And then just reinforcing for voters to encourage healthy voting habits, avoiding the long lines, voting early, in early voting, and really knowing what all the options are. There's even some interesting stories to be told around things like the PPE. In the picture you see here, they have these, great plexiglass, shields that they're using. Some places partnered with community colleges and local machinery shops to help them. There's a lot of PVC being used in elections anyway, and in some cases, these are very makeshift state safety precautions, because that's kind of how we support our elections in this country. We don't really fund it very well. I wanted to do a quick update on vote by mail, because there have been some additional information, some additional studies that have come out. We've had some congressional hearings. There will be 2 of them tomorrow, both one in the House Homeland Security and then one in House Administration. And this was a study that I thought was particularly interesting that came out in July. And what I think is interesting here is that it asked voters, how did you vote in 2016? And then how do you plan to vote in 2020? And you can see that there are a lot more voters expecting, at least in July, to vote by mail in 2020. But we also noticed that all vote by mail states like Colorado right here, where it was 86%, is down to 80%. States like Oregon that have been voting by mail since the 80s, traditionally 97%, down to 90%. Washington State, 97 down to 94. So these states where they've had large numbers traditionally, some of them are going down. And the question there is that a result of some of the rhetoric that we're hearing? Is it some of the challenges to the delivery of the Postal Service and what have you? What I like to focus on is not so much the dates and deadlines of when ballots requests have to be in, but to front load that on when will ballots mail. So this is a graphic that, that we just put together based on some of the information from NCSL. And you can see that the first ballots mail out in North Carolina on September 4th. That's when they mail out their absentee and their vote by mail ballots. Then we've got Kentucky and Pennsylvania, all the way up until Washington State mails out all of their ballots to all their registered voters on the 16th of October as the first day to mail. And so I think if we, instead of focusing on the deadline for making requests and instead focus on ballots will mail in in Michigan on the 19th of September, be the first voter to vote. If you want to get your ballot the first day or the first few days of that process, you need to get your applications in now. And by doing that, we can kind of streamline the application process. We know that some voters are having second thoughts about voting by mail. We saw it in that survey. We know it from hearing from election officials that voters are now concerned because they've been told that it's ripe with fraud. They've heard that the Postal Service may not be around in November, and all of these other challenges that we need to just really make sure that we're getting the right information and accurate information out to voters. In fact, just today, my understanding is the president came out and said it's not a question of the vote by mail, it's now the election officials are the ones that are going to mess this all up, and we won't have a result because of the election officials. It's not the Postal Service. So stay tuned. We'll all be watching the stories that you report and write. We do know, though, that for tens of millions of Americans, for years, their ballots have been handed to them by their postal carrier, not a poll worker. And that's going to be even more so in this moment. The first class mail delivery standard is 2 to 5 days, and standard mail or marketing mail is 3 to 10 days. And so it's important that our voters understand that ballots don't just go across town anymore. They go to the post office, and then they go to a processing plant, and it isn't a 1 or 2 day endeavor any longer. It's a couple of days, and we need to act on that. We also know that, and I mentioned the standard mail or marketing mail there, most of the Western states mail out their ballots using marketing mail. And it's not that they don't think ballots are important enough to go first class. It's that they're mailing them out often weeks before election day. And it used to be the case that first class mail was 1 to 2 day standard and standard or delivery, and standard marketing mail was like a 3 to 4 day. And so if you could cut your mailing costs in half and you're mailing out your ballots anyway a month before election day, many states started doing that, and they've been doing it all along. So there was some concern a couple of weeks ago around this notion that the Postal Service was requiring voters and election officials to pay higher postage rates. That's not the case. The Postal Service has recommended using first class for years, but we know that many jurisdictions still use the marketing mail. And so that's a way of just making sure that when we hear these things, we understand where they're coming from. The Postal Service has also recommended for a number of years that we mail back our ballots a week before they're due. But yet there are almost half the states, 22 of them, allow a voter to make a request for a ballot within that time frame. 7 states allow you to request a ballot on Monday for Tuesday's election to be mailed to you, and first class delivery is 2 to 5 days. New Mexico is the only state here that has, in fact, changed their dates and deadlines to comport with the standards of the Postal Service. It's something that I've been calling for years, and it's difficult though because oftentimes the state legislators and election officials are being told that they're trying to disenfranchise voters, or it's suppressing voters by not allowing them as many days to request, when in reality, you're setting the right expectation, because a voter that can request a ballot on Monday for Tuesday's election is not going to be able to vote successfully. And that's where it's just important that we really do step back a minute and align our dates and deadlines so that it serves the voters well. keeps going back. There we go. There's a report that I wrote on this very thing back in 2016. So if you're thinking of putting out some messaging for voters on what they should think about, there's a checklist right in there and you can pull from it and get some ideas about your coverage. Some states do allow for the postmark to matter for the ballot coming back in. Other states, it has to be in hand on election day. So as you get closer and closer to election day, in those states where a postmark does matter, making sure that you include in your coverage that voters can, you know, if it's Saturday, they can go into the post office and ask to have it be round stamped or hand canceled to make sure that it gets postmarked if it's a state where postmarks matter. And it really does work. I loved this from the primary. I'm in Maryland, and Montgomery County here in Maryland posted this out on their Twitter feed where they had voters using the round stamp and they were able to count their ballot because it was on the envelope. Now, some of the other coverage that we've heard in the last few months is something I wanted to just kind of address and give a quick update on. So we heard earlier in the year that, you know, the Postal Service was going to go bankrupt. It wouldn't survive the summer. Former Postmaster Brennan sent out a letter in March to all of the election officials saying that we do not expect disruption or degradation of the services we provide. And then in July, the Washington Post printed a story about a stand-up talk directive that had come down from the Postmaster General's office saying basically that there'd be no overtime, no late trips, that this was going to be difficult for employees. And this is the bottom piece there, because you might see mail left behind or mail on the mailroom floor or docks, which isn't typical. And the challenge here is that as the mail flows through the postal stream, there are different points where you could have delays. And that's not to say that a ballot is going to encounter all of these challenges and issues as it goes from the elections office to the voter and then back again, but it could encounter one or more of them. And even one in some of those states, if it's close to election day, could be the difference between a ballot counting or not. So making sure voters get their ballots back on time is really important. We know that election officials rely on some of those late trips. This is a message from the Cochise County Elections Department where they're 4 hours away from the processing plant in Phoenix, and they had their local postmaster, you know, went and brought them their ballots late, did a late trip and brought them to them to make sure that they would be counted. Otherwise, their ballots would not have been counted. And that's where we want to make sure that, in fact, the Postmaster General and the Postal Service continues their dedication to what I often refer to as delivering democracy. We also had an announcement of a pilot program that was happening in 200 locations around the country, where urban carriers would in fact have a change in the way that they delivered their mail and how they processed their mail and how they prepared for their mail routes. But it was only in urban centers, and I was very concerned about that. So when I was able to identify where these locations were, I sent the file back to Charles Stewart again at MIT on the zip codes to take a look and see if there was anything, if there was any there. And basically what he found was that when you look at the zip codes in this pilot program in the urban centers versus the zip codes not in the pilot program in the same city, that there was basically, it was statistically insignificant between those two for Black populations, but for the Hispanic population, it really, it was larger and could be statistically significant. So I've asked Charles if he doesn't mind, because I asked him to do this, he was on vacation, if he didn't mind digging into it a little further, just to make sure that we have some transparency in why these changes are happening. We all saw about the sorters, and I will say every year they pull hundreds or more of sorters offline, but the question was the timing of it. There was lack of transparency on where it's happening. And the other issue is that because it's happening so close to election day, it's changing really the resiliency of the entire network. So it's very much the case that there might be, you know, a processing plant that has a couple of extra machines sitting there that maybe they aren't using because all of the mail volumes are down. But if they're nearby to, in the example here, to California where the fires are hitting, there might be more mail that's being routed to their processing plant that they didn't have. And now all they have to do is flip the switch and they've increased their capacity, and the network still has some resiliency and some nimbleness to it, as opposed to not having that. And then also we had what was reported as the Friday night massacre. And that was some changes at the top of the org chart. And again, it's all about the timing and the transparency of why these things are happening and when they're happening. So those are the sorts of things we want to make sure that we keep on top of. The voters are watching. They need to know what their options are, whether or not they have options in how to vote. We need to make sure we're letting them know to be consistent with the way that they sign, the way that they fill in their name in the various forms and information, to act before the deadlines, know all of their options, to flatten the curve, as it were, in both requests and return. And then the last piece on this is that I thought you might find this interesting. 1852 is the earliest time we found when presidential results were being announced in the same week as the election. And that was on Thursday from Tuesday's election. And so it is not the case that we've always known who was going to be the winner and the president on election night. And we also have to keep our eyes on the reports as they come in. I participated yesterday in a tabletop exercise for Denver votes, for Denver, city and county of Denver. And one of the injects in this tabletop exercise that it's election night, the polls are closed, but suddenly the Denver election night resulting application pops up that 90% of the votes went to Kanye West, that it had been hacked and manipulated. It was interesting to hear the local election officials say, well, that's an app where we upload the things, we have all of the official results, we have the PDFs that come off the actual machines, we have the live feed that we give to the Secretary of State's office, we have our AP feed. So it was important to know that even when there can be potential issues that arise, there is some contingency planning and some backup in the system. And then lastly, some of the resources. The Postal Service has something called industry alerts, and that's where that listing of all the places that were closed down because of the fires. It also periodically comes out with which countries aren't allowing mail service currently because of the coronavirus. Electionline.org is a daily news feed all across the country. Some of your news stories and reporting have most definitely been featured on Election Line. It's usually out by about 6 or 6:30 in the morning for those of you who are early risers. The Vote at Home Institute has a wide variety of resources around vote by mail. And just this week, the 2018 Election Performance Index was released by the MIT Election Data Science Lab. So it's a great interactive tool where you can go in and kind of look at ballot rejections. That's a hot topic this week around why are ballots rejected and what to do about it. And then the Center for Technology and Civic Life has a civic data, ballot data resource where you can see what all the offices are, who the candidates are, as a way of kind of informing your reporting. And then the Election Assistance Commission also has information. And I mentioned the Voter Study Group is a collaboration with Nationscape, and there's huge data sets out there that if you're a data geek, you can just dive in and come up for air every once in a while. There have also been some webcasts through the EAC, and the eBench book at William and Mary has a lot of resources for every single state election code is listed in one website, and that's a great place for it. And should there be any questions around the legitimacy of the election, I would bookmark the National Task Force on Election Crisis. There's some very interesting white papers and missives on whether or not the president can cancel or postpone the election, what have you. And so with that, I have my information here. Please feel free to reach out at any point in time. I'm always happy to answer any questions I can around election administration. And with that, I want to open it up, I think, John, for any questions anyone might have.